Anyone who's a regular listener of this program knows that we believe around here that we will not have economic or social justice in this country until we have a strong and vibrant and organized working class. I would say that my next guest is doing heroic work to make that happen. I'm delighted to have her with us. Sara Nelson is the international president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, an AFL-CIO group since 2014. She's serving her second four-year term in that position. She's been a union member since 1996 when she was hired as a flight attendant at United Airlines. She is, among other things, she played a pivotal role in ending the 35-day government shutdown, for which InStyle magazine, according to what I have right here, placed her on their 2019 top 50 badass women list. So with no further introduction, Sara Nelson, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Richard. Really happy to be with you.
Well, I'm delighted to have you here, as I said, and I guess I would start with this. You're a union leader. Unions have clearly shrunk in size, diminished in influence over the last number of decades. I get the sense from you, from what I've read about you and heard from you, that you have a vision for that changing, but assuming that you do, I hate to throw such a big question at you, but what is it?
Well, yeah, thanks for that question.
Right, sorry. Yeah.
So first of all, I am a flight attendant myself, and I'm the leader of the Flight Attendant Union. And we have done a lot of great things throughout the years by having a union of by and for flight attendants, where we've focused on the issues that matter to the people that I represent and the people who also sit on the jump seat next to me as aviation's first responders. But we've also recognized that we have bigger systemic issues to take on, and we can't do that without joining hands with other union members and really understanding our place in the broader democracy. So, for example, we have fought for years to turn our job into a career. We beat back all kinds of discriminatory practices to be able to do that. But we still suffer from sexism in the workplace and gender discrimination, because we are a job that is mostly owned by women. And the truth of the matter is that we have had to fight against this general idea that women and the jobs that we do are not jobs that are as valuable or should be paid as much as men. And that's a reality that we continue to fight against. We also, within our workforce, are experiencing many of the same things that other workers across the entire nation and around the world are experiencing. And that is the contracting out of work, the misclassification of workers. We have regional flight attendants who fly on regional planes that are flying under the flag of mainline carriers, United, Delta, and American, and Alaska, for example. But those workers, the flight attendants on the plane, the pilots on the plane, the people checking you in and loading the bags, are making on average 45% less, and oftentimes don't have the pay and benefits of a mature contract. So this is something that we experience right in our workplace, within our careers. And it's just like what we're experiencing right now and seeing right now on the GM picket line, where GM cried poor and got the ability to hire temporary workers. And it was supposed to be a temporary thing, but really it was just a ploy to be able to pay people less and not treat them with the full benefits of full employment. So this is something that we can recognize across industries, that there is an effort to squeeze workers, and management is sharing these tactics and joining together to do that. And so we have to learn from that, and we have to join together and understand that every single time that we feel that we're in competition with another worker and another worker is holding us down, that is the work of the union buster. That is the work of the union buster, trying to divide us, trying to make us feel like we are in competition with that other worker. And we have to work harder to come together and fight for real change that gives workers real power to stop this growing inequality. So we've got to organize like never before. We've got to get out there and let people, help people understand that the labor movement is the way to have a voice in the workplace, the way to end the pay gap, the way to take on the issues of healthcare and, frankly, the climate crisis that is going on right now, so that we can create an economy that actually works for the workers, and not just for the 1%. So that's our task.
Well, and you know, you I'm glad you offered such a broad agenda there of what the labor movement can address and do, because I think we tend to think in narrow terms about nowadays, and that's partially maybe a reflection of media coverage, the way our politicians have talked about labor in the last 30 years or so. You know, labor gets talked about as an interest group, as if it was the same as, I don't know, big agriculture or the Wall Street or something, and not as, in the most general terms, as a movement that represents most of us, right? 90% of us or so. So, and part of that, I'm also glad that you mentioned, Sara Nelson, the kind of state of mind that goes along with it, the way we've stopped thinking as working people in terms of solidarity with one another. And I think in particular about your industry, which is the airline industry. I'm old enough to remember when getting a job as a flight attendant was a ticket out of the lower middle class world that, you know, I kind of grew up around into, you know, a good living. And where, I mean, I knew a girl in high school whose father was an airline pilot, and that was a lot of money. You know, that was, those things have been eroded away. And nobody has seen that as a loss for everyone. They've seen it as, how do I put it, as, well, those people wanted too much, or they don't think about it at all, or whatever. How would you see us increasing our understanding that we don't have to be divided in that way, that we should all be kind of in this together?
Well, look, this has been one of the ways, in addition to racism and sexism, homophobia, all the ways that management has sought to divide us, make us think that we don't have the same interests and the same values. They've also really driven the idea that some jobs are worth more than others. And what I'm seeing today is that airline pilots, for example, who have often had very highly paid jobs, have been recognized for their education and their skill, and also for the fact that they were men, frankly.
Right.
But they do a very important job, and they have to go through a lot of training to do that, and that has yielded, in many cases, a higher value for that job. But what these pilots are seeing is that now, with global trade agreements, and in the airline industry, they're called open skies agreements, there has been an attempt to actually try to redefine the pilot's job as a job that can be contracted out as well and be flagged in a country where there are no labor laws. And if there were the ability to get a workforce from a place where there's no labor laws, those jobs are going to be undervalued too. So all of a sudden there's a consciousness among a class of workers, a class that management has created, that the issues that hotel workers face on the job could very well be the same issues that they are going to face on the job, because if management gets to define the value of our work, they are always going to undervalue it. And that is really a common theme that is running throughout labor today, and the experience of people out there who have been squeezed. They've been squeezed by bad trade deals. They've been squeezed by bankruptcies as a business tool. And they've been squeezed by a change in our banking laws. And the way that Wall Street operates. Everyone is seeing that the value that we create at work is being handed directly over to Wall Street, and is being shared with the executives because their pay is variable pay in stock options. And there's no focus on the really contributing the value and then receiving a return for what we're contributing. So there's a common understanding and a common theme running here that people are starting to understand. And the other thing that people are starting to understand is that we really have to recognize that anyone who is marginalized within our work group, we have to stand up for them, because when you have one person who's marginalized in your work group, that allows management to marginalize any of the rest of you, or to decide that any decision you make in your private life is their business too. So workers are finding that there are common themes, not only in their workplace, but across industries, and in fact, actually in a globalized workforce around the world today, that we're connected to workers around the world. So, working people have no borders. And this is the common theme that is recurring. And when we pull that out and help people make those connections through our unions, they're already experiencing it, and they get it immediately because the experience is common across the board. People are ready to fight. You connect those fights, and then you organize those fights through the unions, and we can change things very, very quickly.
Again, we're talking with Sara Nelson, who is the international president of the Association of Flight Attendants. There's another dimension to the labor struggle, Sara, that I feel doesn't get enough attention, and that's the kind of psychological oppression that workers have been under for a while, kind of social manipulation. And I would think that you guys, as flight attendants, are at the forefront of it. I remember vaguely, many years back, I think Arlie Hochschild wrote a book, it might have been The Mediated Heart, about workers who were kind of pressured and forced to not only do their jobs, often for insufficient pay and under bad conditions, but one of those bad conditions was you had to pretend to like what no human being would like. The sort of artificial smile, or the, whatever it might be. I know flight attendants have been in that position, especially women in other positions, whether it's someone in my family was in a position where she was kind of asked, you don't want to do the minimum, do you? You want to put that extra something in. Did you know what I'm driving at, and how?
I do. And in fact, what Arlie defined is emotional intelligence. That there's not a value placed on emotional intelligence, and there's an expectation that that management can require a smile of you at work, or a way that you behave at work. But what Arlie did was redefine that and say, yeah, that's a problem, and that's an expectation, and that's almost an abusive behavior by management. But what we really need to do is recognize the value of that work. There are plenty of people who decide they don't want to be a flight attendant because they don't want to deal with all these different personalities all day long. And the fact of the matter is, I work alongside people who de-escalate conflict, who keep us all safer, simply because of the way that they are able to manage people and deal with people. And that's real emotional intelligence. So what's extraordinary about flight attendants, too, is that we're highly trained as safety professionals. And we have to switch back and forth between serving as that safety professional with no distractions, and serving with this incredible emotional intelligence with dealing with people, and having to be able to assess the situation in a way that is not something that can be taught, is not a step-by-step plan that you have to walk through, but really requires your own intuition and intelligent assessment of the situation. So these are jobs and skills that have been undervalued. Oftentimes they're associated with qualities that women express, but many men have wanted to do this work too. And the men who have entered jobs that have been traditionally defined as women's jobs have found out that just because they're men doesn't mean that actually they're going to have a better experience in these jobs. They're often subject to the way that women have been marginalized, or people of color have been marginalized. And so there's a real recognition for places where women and people of color have had a larger portion of have made up a larger portion of that population, where these jobs have been undervalued. And there's a recognition that we have to all hold each other up in order to increase our bargaining power, in order to demand what we truly deserve, and to reject this idea that what we bring to work is not as valuable as what someone who follows a checklist and is trained to follow a checklist does at work. All work has dignity. And within that, recognizing that and understanding the power that we have together, there's real power in just understanding the value that you bring on the job.
And Sara Nelson, since you pointed out or mentioned that flight attendants are safety professionals, among other things, safety can be acted upon in individual ways or on an individual flight by a flight crew, or perhaps more collectively. I'm thinking, for example, of the recent 737 Boeing MAX crashes, which were these tragedies, as awful as they were instructive in multiple ways. And I believe, if I recall correctly, you testified to the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee about it. I might have that wrong, but
no, that's correct.
Okay,
that's correct.
And so how can the union movement in general? We know that the mine workers have tried to work on mine safety. We know that you've touched on this issue. How can a stronger labor movement keep people, workers, and customers or consumers, whatever you want to call them, safer?
Well, we often say that travelers or passengers' travel space is our workspace, and so we're some of the best advocates for passenger safety that there is. Take the Boeing 737, for example. We're not engineers and we're not pilots, but we are in the cabin on those planes. Our lives are on the line as much as any other passenger. And when passengers hear a strange noise or something goes wrong, we are the ones to talk with them, reassure them, explain what's happening, or give them emergency instructions on how to save their lives. So we have to have confidence in the fact that we're flying on secure equipment. And we testified to the fact that when the certification process is going forward, there needs to be a government role there. There needs to be oversight there, because the pressure on these companies to drive to the lowest cost factor so they can drive more and more in these stock options to Wall Street is so huge that it requires the government to come in and play an oversight role that keeps the focus on safety. Because everybody can say all day long, our safety is our number one priority. But if you don't have someone fulfilling that function of keeping safety as the number one priority, there's always a potential of those who are not going to be putting their lives on the line with that equipment to make decisions that cut corners. And so this is part of what we testified to. This is part of the roles that unions play. I also often say that after 9/11, we were some of the most vocal in saying that we needed to have a federalized security workforce. And that goes back to the fact that I'm a Boston-based flight attendant. I knew the entire crew on Flight 175. They were my friends. And I checked in through Terminal C just like those terrorists did that day on September 11th. They went through the same security checkpoint that I would go through every single day on my way to work. And I remember those security screeners. I can hear their voices right now. I can see their faces. I knew them so well because they were there all hours of the day and into the evening. And they were there working double shifts and trying to make ends meet with their family because they were working for the lowest bidding security company. So their wages were terrible. We needed a federalized workforce to make sure that there was a basic standard of living for people with health care, with a pension. And we needed to have that connected to the rest of our security functions. So it was unions who fought for that. And then we became that much safer still when AFGE won the election, the largest union election in 70 years to represent those 70,000 TSA members. Because when you have a union in the workplace, you can have people who feel comfortable to be whistleblowers, who have people who on a daily basis can raise the questions and raise the issues. And management alone is not the one making the decision. You know, safety and security doesn't just happen. You think about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. The Ladies Garment Union had been working for years on fire safety, on safety in these factories. And it wasn't until people died that the regulations could actually get in place. But when you don't have a union on the property today, those fire safety regulations that went into place can be violated today if you don't have a union where people feel safe to be able to raise these issues today and enforce those regulations. So unions help to build the regulations, unions help to enforce the regulations, and give workers the ability, the people on the front lines who know safety and security best, the freedom to be able to speak up. So it's integral to our democracy, it's integral to our safety and security, and it's integral to our ability to push forward and innovate.
And yet, Sara Nelson, and again, we're talking to Sara Nelson, International President of the Flight Attendants Union, and yet there is certainly among, well, in liberal politics maybe, and in the media, for example, the major newspapers don't have labor correspondents the way they used to. There's a sort of, there's been in many cases over recent years a kind of, I don't want to say timidity, but timidity about talking about labor issues. One of the things that I think drew people's attention to you, especially in the wake of the government shutdown, was people had this sense of a certain fearlessness compared to what they were accustomed to. For example, again, if I recall correctly, you were calling for, or at least bringing up the idea of a general strike if the government remained shut down. You certainly responded quickly to the layoff of safety workers in the airports and so on. That suggests a certain, I know a lot of labor leaders might not have called for a general strike. It sounds radical. Now, bearing in mind that I'm all for it, for that kind of thing, did you have to hesitate before using a phrase like general strike if you did? And where do you think that fits into the whole politics of the union movement right now?
Well, I'll tell you, Richard, I, as a labor leader, and I learned about labor by doing this work. So I didn't come from a labor conscious family. But my family certainly did give me a strong sense of justice and drilled into me that we leave no one behind. So I certainly maybe was bred with some union values. But I'll tell you what, I from the early days of my union work, got very quickly that there's a lot we can do as workers to demand our fair share, to demand just conditions by standing together. And so I might have wanted to utter the words general strike for many, many years, but I didn't ever see that there was really an opportunity, the means to do it, the full definition of what was at stake and what was incumbent upon us to fix it. And then in the middle of this shutdown, we had 2 million people who were affected by this, directly affected, because they were either sent home without a paycheck or required to come to work without getting paid. And what that did was it put my members in the private sector in jeopardy too, because our jobs, our safety and security depends on the ability of those government workers to be able to do their job. So as I'm looking at this and trying to figure out how we end this government shutdown, and looking also at what our leverage was to get a deal, because you have to understand what the party's interests are. It was very clear that the White House had no intention of ending this shutdown, because this was only going to accrue a benefit to them the longer it went on. They want to privatize all the functions of government. They want people to say, we don't need, we didn't even miss them. That's what they had hoped. And if there were a catastrophe that happened during that time, that would accrue incredible power to the executive branch to be able to take some action that otherwise might never be possible through a legislative solution. So there was a lot at stake here. And I had seen my friends die before, and that is how seriously I took this. I knew lives were on the line. So at the same time, we were hearing from the public and from a lot of people out in the labor space, well, why don't the air traffic controllers just walk off the job? Why don't the TSA workers refuse to come to work? Well, there's 2 reasons that they couldn't. One, they were under threat of federal indictment, PATCO style federal indictment. And number 2, frankly, they were the real patriots in this scenario, because if they had walked off the job, that would have given the White House everything it needed to be able to argue that these functions needed to be privatized. So I see them as the real patriots in this event. But what I really saw was that when you see workers who are out on strike or being locked out by a company, you don't put it on them to fix that. Labor gets around them, and you use the power of solidarity to lift up those workers who are experiencing that challenge. So I knew it was really important that we start to think about what we could do as flight attendants to help. And I asked my legal department to research this and get me a memo on our legal rights. And they made it clear that flight attendants had the right to refuse to fly those flights if we felt that it was an unsafe condition. And all we had to do was get that communicated out to our members. And we were getting ready to do what we could do and what we knew we needed to do. But when 2 million people were out of work and 400,000 were forced to come to work without pay, and the rest of us were going to work in an increasingly unsafe workspace, I said to the labor movement, what the hell is the labor movement waiting for? This is the time that we need to talk about a general strike. And it was the appropriate thing to do. I didn't hesitate to do it. And I only wanted to make sure that people would hear me when I said it. And that's really what happened, because what you have to do is you have to define what's at stake. You have to define the leverage you have to fix it. And then you have to call for that action. And then that's what we did. And it ended that shutdown within a matter of days.
So, and it was fascinating to me for a variety of reasons. One, because it showed that workers have untapped power that in many cases they're not aware of. Two, because it seemed to me that flight attendants have always had in some way, not legally perhaps, but except in this case, but if flight attendants shut down air travel, then the wheels don't turn on the economy, especially for management in all businesses, because they depend on being able to fly from point A to point B. I mean, maybe the 0.1% as opposed to the 1% has private jets, and maybe they're not covered in this, but a lot of their work and profit making comes to a standstill. That's a lot of power. But the other piece of that story for me is that, the way you described it brings to mind, and I know you've gotten this question before, Sarah Nelson, but your union is part of the AFL-CIO. AFL-CIO is going to be choosing a new president pretty soon. Where do you fit into all that?
Well, I just want to go back for a minute, Richard, about what you were talking about, about the power of flight attendants, because I think that's another key point here. And when we were talking about what we were willing to do, there were many people who said immediately, well, what are the pilots willing to do? Because there was this sort of belief that maybe flight attendants couldn't do this on our own. And I don't speak for the pilots. Now, the pilots were working very closely with us. They were very concerned about this. We were talking day in and day out, working together. But what I kept doing was saying, this is what the flight attendants are willing to do. And what people finally got to was, wow, workers have power in places where we didn't even think power existed. And that's the truth of the matter. Anytime workers get together, put their hands in their pockets together, and stand there and refuse to give their labor in unsafe conditions or unjust conditions, we have the power to make changes, and that's what we did. And that's the way that we have to approach the labor movement moving forward, that one job should be enough, that every job has dignity. And I have had a lot of people say to me, we like what you're saying. We like that you're saying that you recognize that people are ready to fight. And we want a fighting labor movement. And so there's been a lot of talk and a lot of call for me to consider running for president of the AFL-CIO. Now, that's an election that's not going to take place until the fall of 2021. And so I think that we've got a lot of fights on our hands right now that we should stay focused on. But the idea of that, the idea that we can build a fighting labor movement, I am all in on right now, and looking for ways that we can build that right now. because no matter who the leader is, that the movement is what we have to build. The change in the consciousness of workers is what we have to tackle. And I'm going to use every opportunity that I get as president of the Association of Flight Attendants in organizing more flight attendants and in using the power that flight attendants have to raise the consciousness of this country about what labor can do and what young people can do by joining unions or forming unions and running unions. And I really believe we're going to rebuild this labor movement. And that can be done from anywhere, but it has to be done with everyone. So I appreciate that people are recognizing that leadership and saying that they like that leadership. But that's what I'm going to stay focused on, not a single position.
All right. Well, then I guess the last question for you, Sara Nelson. Again, slightly broad, but I hope that's okay. Which is, I come from a union family. My grandfather was one of the early organizers of textile workers and so on, tailors in New York City. My mother was a union teacher. But I also, as a teenager protesting the war in Vietnam, got my butt kicked by George Meany's goons. There was a period in labor history where certain elements of the labor movement were seen as reactionary. And what I think I'm seeing now, what I know I'm seeing now, both inside organized labor and in spontaneously organizing or semi-spontaneously organizing labor, and things like the teachers' strikes and so on of last year, what I think I'm seeing now, and I hope I'm seeing, is a reinvigoration of the labor movement as a progressive force in the broadest sense. And I don't mean electoral politics necessarily, but in the sense of understanding that the workers have rights, that we need to fight for social justice, and that workers have a role in that. Now, I saw a tweet from you saying, let's not use union health plans to, as an argument against Medicare for all and so on. So is it possible that the union movement, the labor movement, has finally completely transcended that sort of period I described, if you agree with my description, and will be and can be a progressive force for the future?
I think that that's what people want. I think people want a labor movement that recognizes that unions are for all workers. You can't separate the social movements from the economic justice movements. You just can't. And that's because workers are diverse. Workers are a rainbow of people with a rainbow of experiences, and our diversity is actually what makes us strong. And if we're not recognizing that strength, but also recognizing that it's our job to lift everyone up because our power depends on that, then we're really losing sight of what it is that gives us power and gives us the ability to make change. I think about the anti-war movement. No matter what position you take in any military operation, let's recognize that the people who are on the ground, the people who are serving in our military, are people who are not making the decisions, and people who come back, and no matter what you think about the conflict that they were sent to take part in, they were there with the idea that they're defending our democracy and our country. And our job as a labor movement is very much connected to them, because when they come home, it is our job to have fought for good jobs for them. That's what we owe them. And so there's a connection between all workers, no matter where you are. And the labor movement cannot say that there are some issues that don't affect labor. In fact, labor is everywhere, and labor has an interest in every issue. And so all you have to do is make sure that you are having a constant mobilization of your membership, engagement with your membership on these issues, solicitation of their involvement in it. And then you can be a part of any discussion that's taking place, and we should be, because it matters to the people that we represent. And if we want to have a strong, fighting, vibrant, relevant labor movement, then we have to recognize that social issues and economic issues are inextricable.
Well, there are a million more things I'd love to ask you, including about sectoral bargaining and other issues, but I am afraid, I know you have a million things to do, and I have to do things like station identification. So, Sara Nelson, International President of the Association of Flight Attendants, thanks so much for your great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I'll look forward to it again.
And me too.